The year is 1806, and the map of Europe has been redrawn by the sword of one man. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of the French, stands at the absolute zenith of his power. He has crushed the Austrian Empire at Austerlitz. He has humiliated the Prussians at Jena. His armies have marched through the gates of Vienna and Berlin, and his brothers sit on the thrones of half the continent. To the observer standing on the bloody fields of Central Europe, it seems as though the war is over. The French eagle flies from the Atlantic to the Rhine. But Napoleon knew the truth. He knew that his victory was an illusion as long as one enemy remained standing. Just 20 miles across the English Channel, the island of Great Britain remained defiant. Napoleon could conquer every capital in Europe, but he could not cross that narrow strip of water. The Royal Navy stood like a wall of oak and iron between the Grand Army and the white cliffs of Dover. The Battle of Trafalgar the previous year had destroyed the French fleet and ended any dream of a military invasion. The Emperor was trapped on the land. He was a lion who could not swim, and his enemy was a shark who could not walk. The stalemate drove Napoleon to a realization that would change the course of history. He realized that he could not defeat Britain with cannons and cavalry. He had to find another way. He looked at his enemy and he saw something that he despised, but also secretly respected. He saw that Britain was not a warrior nation in the traditional sense. It was a commercial nation. He famously dismissed them as a nation of shopkeepers. He believed that their power did not come from the bravery of their soldiers, but from the gold in their banks and the goods in their warehouses. He believed that the British economy was a house of cards held up by global trade. If he could pull out the bottom card, the whole structure would collapse. If he could stop the shopkeepers from selling their goods, they would go bankrupt. If they went bankrupt, they could not pay their sailors. They could not subsidize the armies of Russia and Austria. The war would end not with a bang, but with a bounced check. And so in November of 1806, sitting in the captured palace of the Prussian king in Berlin, Napoleon took up his pen and signed the Berlin Decree. It was a declaration of total economic war. With a stroke of ink, he declared that the British Isles were in a state of blockade. This was an audacious claim because Napoleon had no ships to enforce a blockade. Usually a blockade means surrounding a port with battleships, so nothing can get out. Napoleon decided to invert the very concept of a blockade. He would not block the British ports from the outside. He would block the European ports from the inside. He declared that no ship coming from Britain or its colonies would be allowed to enter any port under French control. He declared that all trade with Britain was illegal. All British goods found on the continent were to be seized and burned. All British subjects found in French lands were to be arrested. He called this the Continental System. It was a plan to turn the entire continent of Europe into a fortress hermetically sealed against British trade. The logic was ruthless. Europe was Britain's biggest customer. If Napoleon could close the door to that market, the factories in Manchester and Birmingham would have nowhere to send their cotton and iron. The warehouses in London would overflow with unsold stock. Unemployment would skyrocket. The British people would riot. The government would fall. It was a siege not of a city, but of an entire economy. Napoleon sent orders to his generals and customs officers across the empire. They were to patrol the coastlines from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean. They were to search every ship and every wagon. The war had moved from the battlefield to the custom house, but the British government was not about to sit idly by and watch their economy be strangled. They were the masters of the sea, and they decided to fight fire with fire. They issued the orders in council. This was a counter-blockade that was even more aggressive than Napoleon's. The British government declared that if Europe would not trade with them, then Europe would not trade with anyone. The Royal Navy established a blockade of the entire French Empire. They told the neutral nations of the world, like the United States, that if they wanted to sail to France, they had to stop in a British port first. They had to pay a tax and get a license. Britain was effectively saying that they owned the oceans. If you wanted to sail on their water, you had to pay their toll. This created a chaotic reality for the merchants of the world. A ship captain sailing from New York to Hamburg was trapped between two giants. If he obeyed the British and stopped in London, Napoleon would seize his ship when he arrived in Hamburg. If he obeyed Napoleon and ignored the British, the Royal Navy would capture him at sea. Legal trade became almost impossible. The price of goods skyrocketed. Coffee, sugar, and tobacco became luxury items that only the rich could afford. The people of Europe who had grown used to these colonial goods began to grumble. Napoleon had promised them glory, but now he was taking away their morning coffee. However, Napoleon had underestimated two things. He had underestimated the resilience of the British economy, and he had underestimated the power of greed. As soon as the legal channels of trade were closed, a massive underground network of smuggling sprang to life. It was the golden age of the smuggler. The British government, knowing they could not force their way into the ports established offshore bases. The most famous was the island of Heligoland. It was a tiny barren rock in the North Sea off the coast of Denmark. The British seized it and turned it into a giant warehouse. It was like a supermarket for smugglers. British merchant ships would unload millions of pounds worth of cotton and sugar on the island. Then, under the cover of darkness, hundreds of small fishing boats would row out from the German and Dutch coasts. They would buy the goods with gold and row them back to the mainland. The French customs officers were overwhelmed. The coastline of Europe is thousands of miles long. It is full of hidden coves and inlets. Napoleon could not put a soldier on every beach, and even when he did, the soldiers were often corrupt. The bribes that the smugglers could offer were huge. A French customs officer, who earned a few francs a day, could make a year's salary by looking the other way for 5 minutes. The corruption went all the way to the top. One of Napoleon's own marshals, Massena, was rumored to be making a fortune selling trading licenses. Even the Empress Josephine Napoleon's own wife continued to buy British muslins and goods because she preferred them to the French alternatives. The most ironic example of this failure occurred in 1812. Napoleon was preparing for his massive invasion of Russia. He needed to equip an army of 600,000 men. He needed hundreds of thousands of pairs of boots and greatcoats. The French textile industry, which Napoleon was trying to protect, was too slow and inefficient to produce them. The quality was poor and the price was high. The emperor's quartermasters faced a dilemma. They could either send the soldiers into the Russian winter barefoot, or they could deal with the enemy. In a secret transaction that highlights the absurdity of the Continental System, the French army purchased thousands of boots and coats from British manufacturers. The transaction was approved by the British government. They reasoned that if Napoleon wanted to pay them gold, they would take it. They knew that gold was more valuable to the war effort than boots were to the French soldiers. So the Grand Army marched to Moscow wearing boots made in Northampton and coats woven in Yorkshire. But while the smugglers and the secret deals kept the goods flowing, the economic strain was real. The Continental System was not just hurting Britain, it was hurting Europe. The port cities of France and Holland were dying. Amsterdam, Bordeaux, and Marseille had built their wealth on shipping. Now their ships rotted at the docks. Grass grew in the streets. The merchant classes who had supported the revolution were facing ruin. They blamed Napoleon. The emperor was sacrificing their livelihoods for a war that seemed to have no end. The system also required Napoleon to constantly expand his empire. This is a crucial point. A blockade is only as strong as its weakest link. If one country in Europe allowed British goods, and those goods would flood across the borders and undermine the whole system. Napoleon became obsessed with plugging the leaks. This obsession drew him into conflicts that he did not need. It was the reason he invaded Portugal. Portugal was an old ally of Britain and refused to close its ports. So Napoleon sent an army through Spain to occupy Lisbon. This triggered the Peninsular War. The French army found itself bogged down in a brutal guerrilla war in Spain that lasted for years. It drained Napoleon of men and money. He called it his Spanish ulcer, and he caught this ulcer because he was trying to enforce the Continental System. He bullied his allies. He forced his brother Louis, the King of Holland, to abdicate because Louis refused to crack down on his own subjects for smuggling. Napoleon annexed Holland directly into France just so he could send his own customs officers to patrol the Dutch canals. He was cannibalizing his own family and his own alliances to sustain the economic war. He was turning every nation in Europe against him. He was no longer the liberator who brought the Napoleonic code and modern laws. He was the tyrant who made bread expensive and destroyed trade. At the center of this financial war was a family that would become legendary, the Rothschilds. Nathan Mayer Rothschild was based in London, and his brother James was in Paris. They operated a banking network that defied the blockade. They had their own fast boats and their own couriers. They moved gold across the channel right under Napoleon's nose. In fact, the French banking system was so underdeveloped compared to the British that Napoleon's own government sometimes unknowingly used the Rothschild network to transfer funds. The British government used the Rothschilds to send gold to the Duke of Wellington, who was fighting Napoleon's armies in Spain. It is a staggering thought. The gold to pay the British soldiers fighting the French was being smuggled through France itself by bankers who were operating in both capitals. As we reach the end of the first part of this story, the stage is set for a cataclysm. The Continental System has turned Europe into a pressure cooker. Britain is suffering. There are riots in the industrial towns of England. Banks are failing. But Britain is holding on. The Royal Navy ensures that while they cannot sell to Europe easily, they can sell to the rest of the world. They are opening new markets in South America and Asia. Meanwhile, the pressure inside Napoleon's empire is reaching the breaking point. The Tsar of Russia is looking at his ruined economy and realizing he has a choice to make. He can obey Napoleon and let his country starve, or he can open his ports and face the wrath of the emperor. The economic war is about to turn into a shooting war on a scale the world has never seen. The blockade that was designed to destroy Britain is about to destroy the man who built it. By the year 1810, the Continental System was tearing the alliance between France and Russia apart. Tsar Alexander I had joined the blockade after the Treaty of Tilsit, believing it would bring peace and partnership with Napoleon. But the economic reality for Russia was catastrophic. Russia was an agrarian economy. Its wealth came from exporting raw materials like timber, hemp, grain, and tallow. Its biggest and most reliable customer had always been Great Britain. When the Tsar closed the ports to British ships, he effectively shut down the Russian economy. The Russian nobility, who owned the forests and the fields, saw their income evaporate. The value of the Russian ruble collapsed, losing half its value in just a few years. The cost of luxury goods imported from France skyrocketed. The Russian aristocracy felt like they were paying a tribute to Paris while getting nothing in return. Alexander was in a precarious position. His father, the previous Tsar, had been assassinated by his own courtiers in part because his foreign policy hurt Russian trade. Alexander feared that if he continued to enforce Napoleon's blockade, he would meet the same fate. He tried to compromise. He issued decrees that made it difficult to import French luxury goods, effectively placing a tariff on his ally. At the same time, he began to turn a blind eye to neutral American ships entering Russian ports. Everyone knew these American ships were often carrying British cargoes, but Alexander needed the trade. Napoleon saw this as a personal betrayal. He had a binary view of the world. You were either with him or against him. He wrote furious letters to the Tsar lecturing him on the importance of the system. He believed that if Russia was allowed to cheat, the whole blockade would crumble. Other nations would follow suit, and the British would win. Napoleon felt he had to make an example of Russia. He had to force them back into the system at gunpoint. This is the great tragedy of the invasion of 1812. It was not a war for territory. Napoleon did not want to rule Moscow. He did not want to annex the Russian steppes. He invaded Russia simply to force the Tsar to close his ports. It was a police action carried out by 600,000 soldiers. It was a war fought for a trade embargo. In June of 1812, the Grand Army crossed the Niemen River. It was the largest military force ever assembled in European history up to that point. It was a multinational army with soldiers from France, Germany, Italy, Poland, and a dozen other nations. They were all marching to enforce the will of the emperor. But as they marched east, something happened that Napoleon had not predicted. The moment his back was turned, the Continental System began to collapse in his rear. With the French army occupied in the depths of Russia, the enforcement of the blockade in the north loosened. British goods began to pour into the Baltic ports. The smugglers became bolder. The very thing Napoleon went to war to prevent was happening because he went to war. The disaster of the Russian campaign is well known. The burning of Moscow, the retreat through the snow, the freezing to death of hundreds of thousands of men. But while the human toll was horrific, the economic consequence was the final nail in the coffin of the French Empire. As the shattered remnants of the Grand Army stumbled out of Russia, the fear of Napoleon evaporated. The nations of Europe, which had been suffering under the economic stranglehold, saw their chance. Prussia rose up. Sweden joined the coalition. Austria mobilized. They were fighting for their national independence, but they were also fighting for their economic survival. They wanted to be part of the global economy again. They wanted British subsidies and British markets. The final campaigns of 1813 and 1814 were fueled by British gold. The British government, having survived the scare of the blockade, poured money into the coffers of Napoleon's enemies. They sent millions of pounds to Russia, Prussia, and Austria. They sent muskets and gunpowder and uniforms. The wealth that the Continental System had failed to destroy was now weaponized to destroy its creator. At the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, Napoleon faced the combined armies of Europe. He was defeated not just by superior numbers, but by the collective exhaustion of a continent that was tired of his economic experiments. When the Allies finally marched into Paris in 1814 and forced Napoleon to abdicate, one of the very first acts of the new government was to abolish the Continental System. The decrees were torn down. The customs officers were dismissed or told to stop searching for British labels. The ports were thrown open. Contemporary accounts describe the scene in the ports of France. British ships sailed in for the first time in years. They were greeted with cheers. Merchants rushed to buy coffee and sugar and cotton. The prices of these goods dropped overnight. It was a moment of sheer relief for the common people who had spent years drinking chicory instead of coffee and wearing rags instead of cotton. The legacy of the Continental System is profound. It was a failure, but it was a failure that changed the world. It proved that in the modern era, economic power is as important as military power. Napoleon was a military genius. He won almost every battle he fought, but he lost the war because he could not understand the invisible forces of the market. He tried to command the economy like he commanded a regiment of cavalry, and he found that the economy does not obey orders. You cannot court-martial a supply and demand curve. The system also had unintended consequences that shaped the future. Because Europe was cut off from British-manufactured goods, industries on the continent were forced to innovate. The beet sugar industry is the most famous example. Before the blockade, all sugar came from sugarcane, grown in the tropics. When the British Navy cut off the supply, French scientists figured out how to extract sugar from beets grown in European soil. It was a massive technological breakthrough that is still with us today. Similarly, the textile industries in places like Saxony and Alsace developed rapidly because they had a captive market protected from British competition. However, this protectionism also had a downside. When the war ended and the trade barriers came down, many of these industries collapsed because they were not efficient enough to compete with the British. It taught the world a lesson about the dangers of artificial markets. For Britain, the victory was total. They had withstood the greatest economic assault in history. They had proven that a maritime nation with a strong financial system could outlast a continental military power. The Bank of England emerged as the financial hub of the world. The Royal Navy was undisputed master of the seas. The trade networks that Britain built to survive the blockade, particularly with South America and Asia, became the foundations of the Victorian global empire. Britain had been forced to look beyond Europe, and in doing so, it became a truly global superpower. Napoleon spent his final years in exile on the remote island of St. Helena. It was a supreme irony. The man who had tried to lock Britain out of the world was now locked away by Britain on a rock in the middle of the ocean. He spent his time dictating his memoirs, trying to justify his actions. He argued that the Continental System would have worked if he had just had a little more time. If only the Russians hadn't betrayed him. If only the Spanish hadn't rebelled. He never understood that the system was flawed from the start. He never understood that trade is like water. It flows where it wants to flow. You can build a dam, but eventually the water will rise and break it. The story of the Continental System is a warning from history. It warns us about the limits of political power. It warns us that when a government tries to fight against the economic interests of its own people, it is fighting a losing battle. The smugglers of Heligoland, the bankers of London, and the bootmakers of Northampton were not soldiers. They did not carry muskets. But in the end, they were the ones who defeated the emperor. They proved that the ledger is mightier than the sword. And that is how the Nation of Shopkeepers brought down the master of Europe. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming. Empires fall in silence, unnoticed until it's too late. Don't forget to subscribe and join those who see what others won't.